On 9 July 2011, South Sudan held its formal independence ceremony in Juba, the capital, an event that marked a departure for Africa. While most African countries became independent on a negotiated transfer of power from a colonial authority to a new national elite, South Sudan's independence came from the directly expressed will of its people. The journey to independence for the people of South Sudan is a saga of resilience, determination, and unwavering hope. Spanning nearly 2 centuries from 1821 to 2011, this path was marked by relentless struggles and profound hardships. The people of South Sudan had endured oppressive colonial rule only to find themselves under the grip of radical Islamic regimes in Khartoum. Despite these challenges, the indomitable spirit of South Sudan's people remained unbroken. Their relentless pursuit of freedom and self-determination culminated in the historic independence ceremony on July 9, 2011. The history of South Sudan is deeply connected with that of the Republic of Sudan. Prior to the European scramble for Africa, the land now known as South Sudan did not exist as a unified country in the modern sense. Instead, the region was home to various small, medium, and large ethnic groups that coexisted in relative harmony. Sudan's diverse ethnic and religious groups were unified for the first time under a centralized administration during the Turco-Egyptian colonial rule, which lasted from 1820 to 1882. In the early years of the Turco-Egyptian rule, southern Sudan remained relatively isolated. However, by 1827, collaboration between the occupiers and northern Arab groups led to deeper penetration into the region, resulting in frequent raids for ivory and slaves. Some scholars have argued that northern Sudanese were complicit in slave trade practice through collaborating with the Turco-Egyptian rulers to sell southerners to Arab slave markets. Even before this occupation, southern Sudan was already a source of slaves and ivory. But under the Turco-Egyptian rule, the slave trade became a state-sanctioned activity, growing rampant and widespread, reaching deep into the south, the Nuba Mountains, and southern Darfur. The slave trade peaked in the late 19th century, with many southern Sudanese, primarily from the Dinka region, being enslaved and sold like cheap commodities by Arab, European, Egyptian, and Turkish traders. All this had the net effect of instilling and entrenching prejudices, stereotypes, mistrust, and hostilities that would characterize relations between the northerners, who were mainly Afro-Arabs, and the southerners, who were mostly black Africans. The Turco-Egyptian occupation ended in 1882 when the northern Sudanese revolted under the leadership of Mohammed Ahmed ibn al-Sayyid Abdallah, who called himself the Mahdi. After the British occupied Egypt in 1882, they attempted to intervene militarily in Sudan, but they were unable to suppress the rise of the Mahdi. In 1885, Mahdist forces captured Khartoum, defeated the troops of the British General Charles Gordon, and established Sudan's first theocratic state using Islam as a unifying force. The rule of the Mahdi was equally brutal for the inhabitants of southern Sudan. The slave trade continued with even greater intensity, and Arabic and Islam were forcibly imposed on the south. In 1898, the Mahdist state was defeated by Anglo-Egyptian occupation forces. The following year, in 1899, the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium was established, allowing Sudan to be jointly administered by Egypt and Britain. However, despite the appearance of equal partnership, the British dominated the administration from the outset, effectively controlling the condominium. Within the first 2 decades, most of Sudan's borders were defined, and nearly all the territory of modern-day Sudan came under firm British control. Railroads were constructed to link key areas of economic interest and to control the Upper Nile along the White Nile. Schools were established in Khartoum and several major urban areas, catering primarily to the children of affluent families and colonial civil servants. During this period, nearly all economic infrastructure and development projects were concentrated in the agriculturally rich north-central region. In contrast, the South saw minimum investment in economic, social, and administrative structures. As you can already tell, during the colonial era, the administration of North and South Sudan was distinctly different. At this point, I need to state that Northern Sudan was heavily Arabized and had a fairly well-structured political and economic infrastructure. Northerners practiced Islam and were relatively well-educated. Meanwhile, Southern Sudan was mainly composed of various Nilotic tribes who practiced a mixture of Christian and traditional beliefs. In 1922, the British instituted a separate system for the southern region comprising the provinces of Equatoria, Bahr el Ghazal, and Upper Nile. These three provinces were administratively segregated and largely neglected in terms of social and economic development. The few social services available, such as schools and clinics, were predominantly provided by Christian missionaries. As a result, the southern region remained chronically underdeveloped in education, healthcare, and basic infrastructure. The colonial administration also instated a policy called the Southern Policy. Under this Southern Policy, nearly all relations between the northern and southern regions were cut. Northern Sudanese were barred by law from entering or residing in the south. Even long-term northern residents, especially Arab merchants, were forced to leave the south. Similarly, native southerners were prohibited from traveling to or seeking employment in the north. The spread of the Arabic language and Islam was restricted in the south, while Christianity and the English language were promoted. The whole purpose of the Southern Policy was to maintain Southern Sudan as a distinct entity from Northern Sudan. Reflecting this separation, colonial governors from Southern Sudan attended regular administrative conferences in East Africa rather than in Khartoum in the north. The separation of the south from the rest of Sudan and the imposition of a distinct administrative system served important British colonial interests. These interests included preventing the spread of Arab and Muslim influence, preparing the southern region for eventual integration with the British East African Federation, as well as controlling the sources along the Nile. However, by the 1930s and 1940s, as the issue of independence began to dominate political discourse, the British started to shift their stance. Pressured by a growing nationalist movement in the north, Britain reversed its southern policy roughly a decade before granting Sudan independence. They lifted all restrictions that had separated the southern region from the north and acceded to northern demands for a united Sudan. Movement between the two regions was permitted, allowing northerners to return to their administrative posts in the south. Arabic replaced English as the official language of administration in the south and was also introduced as a school subject. Additionally, the ban on Muslim preaching in the south was also lifted. During this period, as preparations were being made towards eventual independence for Sudan, a conference was held in Juba, the capital of Equatorial Province in the south, from June 12 to June 13, 1947. At this particular conference, the new One Sudan policy was forced upon the South by the British and supported by Northerners. Southern chiefs, many of whom were uneducated, were pressured to endorse the conference resolutions at face value. The Southern chiefs were assured that a post-independence government would give the South autonomy over its affairs. But unfortunately, as you see in this story, this never happened. Negotiations on self-determination in the early 1950s confirmed Southern fears of Northern domination. Northern nationalists excluded Southerners from these crucial discussions and reneged on their pre-independence promise to establish a federal system between the Northern and Southern regions, opting instead for a centralized system. Continued calls from Southerners for federalism, equal representation in government, and fair inclusion in national institutions were largely ignored. Also, the Sudanization process, aimed at replacing colonial administrators with Sudanese nationals, was heavily biased in favor of Northerners. Out of 800 civil service positions, Northerners occupied 792, while Southerners held only 8. This disparity arose because most Southerners were disadvantaged by the replacement of English with Arabic as the official language of communication, and they often lacked the necessary experience and qualifications. As a result, there was widespread discontent in the South following the 1954 elections and the Sudanization process. The rapid influx of Northerners into the South as administrators, senior army and police officers, government school teachers, and merchants exacerbated Southern fears of Northern domination and colonization. It is suffice to say, the failure by the British colonial administration to design and facilitate a smooth transition process from colonialism to independence left a ticking time bomb in Sudan. In a fit of fury, Southern troops in the National Army rebelled in August 1955, just 4 months before Sudan's independence in January 1956. They fled into the bush to join fellow Southerners in the fight for their rights and self-determination.
The world has gained a new nation. The Sudan, for 58 years under the joint rule of Britain and Egypt, becomes an independent republic. The Proclamation of Independence is read from the balcony of the House of Representatives in Khartoum, and the new flag is hoisted. Blue for the Nile, yellow for the desert, green for agriculture.
Consequently, a united Sudan achieved independence already burdened by the weight of civil war on its young shoulders. The First Sudanese Civil War was ignited by a rebellion in Torit, Equatoria in August 1955. In this instance, rebels targeted army garrisons, administrators, and merchants whom they saw as symbols of northern domination. Northern officers, administrators, traders, and their families were hunted down and killed. In response, the authorities in Khartoum reasserted control by dispatching approximately 8,000 troops from the north. In this retaliation by the government, some mutineers were captured, tried and executed, while most of them fled into exile in Uganda. The exiled movement that had been formed by the mutineers, the Sudan African Nationalist Union (SANU), declared their goal of independence for the South. However, significant armed resistance did not begin until 1962 when SANU organized a guerrilla army known as the Anyanya. By 1969, the rebels had established foreign contacts to secure weapons and supplies. Israel, for instance, trained Anyanya recruits and shipped weapons to the rebels via Ethiopia and Uganda. The Anyanya also procured arms from Congolese rebels. By the late 1960s, the conflict in Sudan had claimed the lives of approximately 500,000 people, with several 100,000 more Southerners hiding in forests or fleeing to refugee camps in neighboring countries. After the 1969 coup d'etat in Sudan, the Sudanese government's efforts against the rebels diminished. In 1969, a military coup in Sudan brought the Revolutionary Command Council to power, determined to eliminate religion-based political groups. The council was led by 39-year-old officer Hafani Meri, who had experience in the south and advocated for a political settlement involving regional self-government rather than military repression. But Nimeri's regime faced significant opposition from various factions intent on overthrowing him. The first challenge to his regime came from conservative forces led by Imam al-Hadi al-Mahdi, a grandson of the renowned Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmad. A second challenge to Nimeri arose in 1971 from communist dissidents within the army who staged a brief coup and imprisoned him. However, loyal troops quickly overwhelmed the dissidents and Hafani Meri regained control. Having consolidated his control, Hafani Meri sought to reach an accommodation with the South. Recognizing that ending the civil war would strengthen his political power base, he opted for a political solution to this first Sudanese civil war. In this regard, in 1972, high-level delegates from both the Sudanese government and the guerrilla forces met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and after a series of negotiations, they agreed to end the conflict. The Addis Ababa Agreement linked the three southern provinces together as a separate region with its own elected assembly and executive authority. Additionally, the Anyanya guerrillas were integrated into the ranks of the Sudanese army. The new constitution of 1973 established Sudan as a secular state, guaranteeing freedom of worship for Christians, Jews, and followers of traditional religions who formed the vast majority in the south. Secular law governed civil and criminal matters for all civilians, while personal and family matters were governed by Sharia law for Muslims and customary law for rural populations in the south. The 1972 Addis Ababa Agreement represented a rare example in Africa of a negotiated end to a civil war, and Hafan Imeri was rightly credited for meeting many key southern demands. Unfortunately, this peace was short-lived, and ironically, one of the main architects of its downfall was Hafan Imeri himself. The 1972 peace agreement between the North and the South faced growing tensions over time. Both sides had factions that were never fully reconciled with the compromises made in the 1972 agreement. Southerners were particularly discontented with the central government's continued control over economic planning in the South and the inadequate funds allocated for Southern development. The discovery of oil deposits in the South in 1978 also became a significant point of contention. Following the US-based Chevron Corporation's discovery of vast oil reserves in the Bentiu district in 1978, Southern Kordofan and Upper Nile in 1979, and the Unity oil fields in 1980, the Southern Regional Government advocated for an oil refinery to be built in the south close to the oil fields. However, like much of the political elite of northern Sudan, Hafan Imeri had no intention of sharing the oil revenue with the South. Control of oil resources became a critical issue in the struggle between the North and the South. The South grew increasingly convinced that the central government intended to exploit the newly discovered oil reserves for the North's benefit, leaving the South with minimal gains. Also during this time, further disputes arose due to Hafan Imeri's persistent interference in southern politics. This interference, combined with Nimeri's growing alliance with Islamic factions, deepened the distrust in the south. In an effort to broaden his support base in the north, Hafan Imeri incorporated two prominent Islamic politicians into his government in 1977. In this regard, he included Sadiq al-Mahdi, the great-grandson of the 19th century Mahdi. Hafan Imeri also brought in Sadiq's brother-in-law, Hassan al-Turabi, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood and founder of the militant National Islamic Front, the NIF, whom Hafan Imeri had previously imprisoned. After being appointed as Sudan's Attorney General, Hassan al-Turabi applied consistent pressure for the Islamic reform of the legal system. Turabi also led efforts to redraw the northern borders to include the South's oil fields as well as the agriculturally productive areas of Upper Nile province. This move violated the Addis Ababa Agreement, which recognized the southern boundaries established during colonial rule. By 1983, Hafan Imeri had abandoned the careful balance he once sought and declared an Islamic revolution in Sudan. Nimeri decreed that Sudan would become an Islamic republic governed by Islamic law, and also that traditional Islamic punishments such as amputation for theft, flogging for alcohol consumption, and death for apostasy were to be enforced nationwide, including in the south. In a similarly arbitrary fashion, Hafan Imeri dissolved the southern regional government and divided the south into three smaller regions corresponding to the old provinces that had governed the south before 1972. This decree not only broke the Addis Ababa Agreement, but also proclaimed that henceforth Arabic would be the exclusive official language of the whole country. Several southerners opposed to subdivision were incarcerated or threatened with their lives. Also in pursuit to transform Sudan into the breadbasket of the Middle East, the Sudanese government expanded large-scale mechanized farming into the southern region. This expansion, particularly around the Upper Nile and southern Kordofan provinces, resulted in the expropriation of farming and grazing lands from indigenous farmers and native pastoralists. This appropriation of the land led to significant resentment and hostility in the south. Now, the issues pertaining to oil, the imposition of Sharia law across Sudan, the appropriation of farming land in the south by the central government, as well as a string of several other issues would result in the Second Sudanese Civil War. In May 1983, a battalion of southern troops in the Sudanese army stationed in Bo and led by Major Kerubino Kwanyin Bo rebelled against orders to be redeployed to the north. This mutiny would mark the beginning of organized armed resistance against the central government. In the following month of June, Colonel John Garang de Mabio was tasked by the Sudanese government to travel south and persuade his colleagues to abandon the rebellion. However, John Garang ended up joining them instead. The mutiny by the southern forces quickly spread, with other southern units joining the rebellion, leading to the formation of the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the SPLA, and its political wing, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the SPLM, both under the leadership of Colonel John Garang. Born into the Dinka ethnic group, John Garang was educated in Tanzania and graduated from Grinnell College in Iowa in 1969. He returned to Sudan, joined the Sudanese army, but left the following year to join the Anyanya in the south. In 1972, following the Addis Ababa Agreement, rebel fighters including John Garang were integrated into the Sudanese army. Here in the army, Garang was promoted to colonel and received training at Fort Benning in Georgia in the United States. Now, in 1983, after the mutiny, John Garang de Mabio became the chairman and commander-in-chief of the SPLA and the SPLM, with Kerubino Kwanyin Bo stepping down and nominating him. The organization's primary objective, as outlined in its manifesto, was to prevent Sudan from inevitable disintegration by providing a correct solution to the nationality and religious questions within the context of a united Sudan, as well as establish a new cultural order within a new Sudan. In Sudan, the early 1980s saw severe drought and famine, particularly in the western regions. The government's inadequate response to the crisis further fueled public anger and discontent within the country. By the mid-1980s, Sudan was experiencing widespread protests and civil unrest. Amidst the growing turmoil, Hafani Meri left Sudan for a state visit to the United States in early April 1985, and during his absence, on April 6, 1985, the military, led by Defense Minister Abdel Rahman Swar al-Dahab, staged a coup d'etat. This coup d'etat against Hafani Meri was largely bloodless and was supported by widespread popular approval. Following the coup, General Abdel Rahman Swar al-Dahab headed a transitional military government and promised to oversee a transition to civilian rule, as well as to address the issues that had led to widespread discontent and unrest during Hafani Meri's regime. General Swar al-Dahab's government organized national elections, which were held in April 1986. Following these elections, a civilian government was established and Sadiq al-Mahdi, the leader of the Umma Party, became the Prime Minister of Sudan. Meanwhile, by 1989, the war in the south had turned decisively against the government in Khartoum, and SPLA guerrillas roamed freely across much of southern Sudan. Under pressure from the army and facing severe financial difficulties, Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi entered into negotiations with the SPLM, agreeing to suspend the implementation of Islamic law as part of a peace initiative. However, the concessions Sadiq al-Mahdi was willing to make were too much for Islamic militants, and just before Sadiq al-Mahdi was set to meet with the SPLM leader John Garang in Addis Ababa, a group of militant officers backed by the National Islamic Front staged a preemptive coup d'etat. This coup was led by Lieutenant General Omar al-Bashir and his National Islamic Front. Omar al-Bashir was backed by Hassan al-Turabi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and he assumed office on 30 June 1989. Unfortunately, this coup d'etat by Omar al-Bashir and the NIF not only derailed peace negotiations with the SPLM, but also placed Sudan under the control of Islamic militants intent on enforcing their version of Islamic rule. The Sudanese constitution was suspended, parliament was dissolved, political parties and trade unions were banned, and newspapers were shut down. By early 1991, the SPLA was on the brink of gaining control over most of the south. However, the collapse of the Derg regime in Ethiopia in May of that year deprived the SPLA of its bases, supply and support, leaving it vulnerable to a flanking attack through Ethiopia by the Sudanese army. The South's suffering was further compounded by the resurgence of internecine warfare among rival southern factions. In this regard, in August 1991, the Nuer guerrilla commander Riek Machar attempted to wrest control of the SPLM-SPLA from Colonel John Garang, who had led the movement since 1983 in what was alleged to be a dictatorial manner. Machar became increasingly disillusioned with the leadership of John Garang. John Garang was a vocal opponent of the northern-based central government's policies and actions in the south. However, Garang's goal was not southern independence, but rather a united secular Sudan where the south, along with other marginalized areas, would have equal opportunities for development and prosperity. But this stance contrasted with that of other SPLA leaders such as Riek Machar, who supported the idea of a completely independent southern Sudan. In August 1991, the SPLM-SPLA would split into two factions, one led by John Garang, known as the Torit or mainstream faction, and the other led by Riek Machar, known as the Nasir or united faction.
Well, it's any war is a disaster, including our own, including the Second World War, including the First. All wars are disasters. What has happened in the SPLM is that a portion of the movement under Riek Machar and Lamakol has technically joined the enemy. It's a defection, it is not a split. Somewhere on our side, they have now gone on the Sudan government side. Some do defect from the Sudan government side to come to our side. That is the meaning of a civil war.
As the rebel army split along ethnic lines, Riek Machar was accused of carrying out a brutal massacre in the Dinka-dominated town of Bor in 1991 in what has been described as one of the worst atrocities of the war. Taking advantage of the split in the south, the central government in Khartoum struck a deal with Riek Machar, providing him with weapons to combat John Garang and steering clear of combat in areas that were under Riek Machar's control.
Yeah, I cannot deny it can be true because Riek has no objective. His objective is to destroy SPLA, is to fight us. He's not fighting the Sudanese government. So now his target is here.
After assuming power, Sudan's new leader, Omar al-Bashir, led the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation in governing the country. However, the RCC primarily served as a vehicle for the National Islamic Front, an Islamist political party with a fundamentalist agenda. Omar al-Bashir and his colleagues ruthlessly imprisoned hundreds of political opponents and vigorously pursued the war in the south, though their efforts were constrained by the deteriorating national economy. Unable to defeat the SPLA on the battlefield, the government armed and deployed an Arab militia against their traditional African rivals, mainly the Dinka. Additionally, they consistently ignored pleas for food aid and obstructed the efforts of Western humanitarian relief agencies who were trying to provide assistance. Caught between the two armies, plundered by Arab militias, and ravaged by persistent drought, countless Africans fled to northern towns and cities or sought refuge in Ethiopia. Meanwhile, the civil war continued unabated. The deaths of some rival faction leaders and ceasefire agreements between John Garang and Riek Machar would reduce much of the infighting, and numerous ceasefires, agreements, and peace discussions also took place during this decade and into the early 21st century. Although these efforts did not yield immediate success, some of the later agreements laid the groundwork for the eventual peace solution in 2005. The toll of the Second Sudanese Civil War was devastating. More than 2 million people had been killed and around 4 to 5.5 million had been displaced since the war resumed in 1983. Spanning 22 years, it became the longest civil war in African history. With efforts from external actors, Riek Machar eventually rejoined John Garang's SPLM-SPLA. This reunification strengthened the movement's position and shifted the focus towards a more comprehensive peace process. Sudan's civil war finally came to an end on January 9, 2005, when the SPLA, SPLM, and the government of Sudan signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, mediated by the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. The CPA built upon several previous negotiations and agreements that had been signed in Machakos and Naivasha, Kenya, and it provided for a new national constitution and outlined measures for power sharing, wealth distribution, and security throughout the country. The distribution of seats in the Central Parliament was successfully negotiated even for the three areas disputed between the North and South. In the CPA, state offices were allocated between the signatories and an agreement was reached on sharing oil revenues. The CPA also established a separate administration for Southern Sudan and stipulated that a referendum on independence for the region would be held in 6 years. Another significant provision was that Sharia law would apply only to Muslims even in the north. Following the signing of the CPA, John Garang de Mabio was appointed as the first Vice President of Sudan as well as President of the Southern Sudan government. Tragically, John Garang de Mabio died in a helicopter crash on July 30, 2005, just 21 days after assuming office. His death led to Salva Kiir Mayardit taking over the presidency. In April 2010, Salva Kiir was re-elected president of Southern Sudan with an overwhelming 93% of the vote. The following year, in 2011, the people of Southern Sudan voted on secession from Sudan, with nationals casting their ballots from around the world. According to the South Sudan Referendum Commission, 3.9 million people registered to vote, including those residing in other countries, and an estimated 3.8 million participated in the referendum. 98.8% voted for secession, while just over 1% voted for unity.
And whatever the problems, this is their moment. It's a time for celebration. Poverty won't disappear overnight, but what Southern Sudanese saw as a northern occupying force has gone.
We are free. We feel now that we are human beings in our own land that God has given to us, and we are free people. This is really the beginning of a new country from zero, really from nothing.
The women who break rocks at the roadside.
South Sudan was officially recognized as an independent nation on July 9, 2011, becoming the 54th country in Africa and the 193rd member of the United Nations.
A nation is born. The symbol of its sovereignty and identity flies for the first time. The scene in South Sudan is nothing less than electric. Hundreds of thousands of people converge on Juba, the world's newest capital city. They celebrate their long-awaited independence, marked by 2 civil wars over 5 decades and countless lives lost. What was Africa's largest nation is now split into 2. Dignitaries from around the world attend the midday ceremony, including the leader of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir. His government was the first to recognize the new state and its new president, Salva Kiir.